I'm Larry Walklin. Our conversation today is with Floyd Kalber, an individual who has roots in Nebraska and who has had the opportunity to work in broadcast journalism both in Nebraska and in other places in the nation. Floyd, let's talk a little bit about your start in the business. Where did you start in broadcasting?
Kearney, Nebraska.
What station?
KGFW.
What did you do on KGFW?
This was a radio station. It was the only station in town, and it was in the days before there was any television anywhere in the country.
What were your responsibilities there?
I was a general announcer. I did news. I did farm news. I did sportscasting. I did writing, continuity writing or commercial writing. Swept the floor, that type of thing, everything.
Now, as I understand it, the manager at that time was a man named Anson Thomas. Was he the person who gave you the opportunity to work at KGFW?
Yes. Anson was the general manager. His brother was Lloyd Thomas, who was quite a well-known figure here in Lincoln, in the legislature, I think, at one time. The two of them owned the station, but Anson was the on-site manager, operator.
What was the station like when you started?
It was on the second floor of a bank building, very small, a couple of cubicles for us off a main general reception room, an office for the program director who happened to be a woman. We had a bookkeeper and Anson in Lloyd's office. We had a small studio and an announce booth that I remember the door to the announce booth had a screen door hook to hold it closed. And then off sort of a reception room for the studio was a wire room. We had one wire machine. It was the United Press. And that was it.
How long were you with KGFW?
A year and 9 months.
And what got you to move on?
A friend of mine, a man that I met when he came out to work at KGFW, left and went to Peoria, Illinois. And when he got to Peoria, to a brand new station, WIRL, just going on the air, he called me or wrote to me, I'm not sure which. In those days you didn't call with a frequency. It was 1947, 48. He told me that there was an opportunity there for a sportscaster. They had no sportscaster. They were just forming the staff. And he suggested that if I might want to inquire about going to work there. I was very, very caught up in sportscasting. I wanted very much to be involved in it. So I communicated with them and went back there. I'm unclear now as to whether I went back for an audition. I must have. And they hired me. They asked me to come to work.
And
it was an opportunity up the ladder.
How did the WIRL opportunities compare with those from KGFW?
Well, it was a much, much larger community. It was, if you want to talk about it in terms of closer to the big time, it was, 150 miles from Chicago. It had a lot of potential of moving up to Chicago because that was sort of the history of the town. There were Chicagoans like Jack Brickhouse, who was quite a well-known name in sportscasting. Vince Lloyd, who had gone through WMBD in Peoria up to work with Brickhouse in WGN in Chicago. Jack Quinlan was another name. I thought the possibilities were good. At that time, that was what I thought I wanted. So we moved over there. By this time, I was married, and by the time we moved over there, we were also pregnant, ready to have a child.
As I recall, you were married while you were in Kearney, is that right?
I'm sorry?
You were married during the time you were working in Kearney.
I got the job in September of 1946 when I went to Kearney, and I talked my wife into marrying me 3 weeks after I got the job. A certain degree of confidence there that really wasn't there.
But it was a successful opportunity there, and so
Yes.
you used that as the leverage, I suppose, in terms of the
Yes.
the discussion. Well, so how long did you stay at WIRL?
About a year and a half. I did sports. I was exclusively a sportscaster. I did, but I also did some news on weekends. I did baseball, and I did basketball, which in that town was important because the Bradley University team was very big, very good, and very high ranked nationally. They played in the National Invitational Basketball Tournament every year practically, and either placed or won that tournament. I had the opportunity of doing their games while I was in Peoria, along with the baseball, and I had the opportunity of going to Madison Square Garden in New York to do the games when they were in the NIT in 1949, which we found out later they had thrown the games to the gamblers and had lost purposely, where I think they could have won the tournament.
My goodness.
It was crooked. Some awfully nice guys got involved with some wrong people.
How long after that event did it become apparent that there was a problem there?
We didn't learn about that until, I think it was 6 months, maybe even a year after that happened. And by that time, I had left the Peoria station. I quit that radio job in Peoria, not because of any of that, but because I had seen television in New York. I felt that it was the way of the future, and I felt that was the way I wanted to go. And after some advice from my father-in-law, who was in Omaha, who told me about a couple of stations starting up in Omaha, I quit my job in Peoria, returned to Omaha with my wife and newborn son, and tried to get work in a television station there. It took about 5 months. In the spring of 1950, the spring of 1950, I got a job with KMTV, owned by the May Broadcasting Company out of Shenandoah, Iowa. And out of 3 of us in the station, I was the only one who had done any news work in radio. One fellow was a sportsman. The other fellow, my friend, who I'd worked with in Kearney and in Peoria, was a disc jockey music type of person. And I was a news person. So I was sort of relegated to set up the news section of the television station. I was the one-man news department and started to work on that in the spring of 1949. And didn't stop it and didn't leave it until I went to NBC in Chicago in 1960.
Now, who were these other individuals who were there with you in this 3-person?
Well, they were, you want names?
Yes.
The sportsman was a fellow by the name of Hugh Bader, B-A-D-E-R, out of Fremont. And the other man was a fellow by the name of Lou Gephardt, who went by the name of Lou Jeffries. Lou had been in Peoria. We'd worked over there in that radio station. He had left before I did and gone to the May Broadcasting radio station in Shenandoah, Iowa, and then came on up to Omaha to the television station. Lou ultimately became the program director of KMTV after working as an announcer, talk show host type of thing. And Hugh Bader, the sportsman, disappeared after about 2 years, along about 1951, 52, never to be heard of again. I've never heard of him since.
Well, what was it like to be the one-man news department, and how did that transpire, and how did it evolve?
Well, it was very interesting. We needless to say, we didn't do very much. We were not on the air very long. We were on the air every day, but not for any long period of time. You think of television today as either being a 24-hour-a-day job on the air, or you think of it maybe being off 3 or 4 hours of the day. In those days, we were on the air 2, maybe 3, maybe 4 hours, off the air the rest of the time. The purpose for that was that there was no interconnection between Omaha and Chicago and the east or west coast. There was no microwave that hadn't been invented or devised. There was only the coaxial cable that was rentable from Northwestern Bell. In other words, they could hook us into Chicago with a coaxial cable, but it cost thousands of dollars. And this was just not economically feasible at that time.
What was the network affiliation?
We were a CBS affiliate at that time, and we did get kinescopes of CBS television programs, but very few. I remember the kinescopes were Arthur Godfrey's Talent Scouts, Studio One. I believe Firestone had a dramatic program of some sort, like the Firestone Hour, and these would be shipped out by air. And we got them in the house, and we'd run them on specific nights, Tuesday, Wednesday, Friday night, or something like that. The other nights of the week, we were left to shift for ourselves if we didn't get any kinescopes. And we would have to come up with either live programming, or we would have to find some films somewhere. Well, we couldn't generate enough live programming. It was costly, and we really didn't have enough people to do that type of thing. There may, at that time, have been 20, 21 people in the entire station, and most of them were engineers. We had probably 2 or 3 salesmen, sales manager, a vice president who was in Shenandoah a good share of the time, but spent some time in Omaha, the program director who spent a good share of his time in Shenandoah and a little time in Omaha. We were sort of operating like a satellite up there. And we could not do the live programming. We went to the Union Pacific Railroad, Public Relations Department. We knew that Union Pacific made beautiful travel films with their trains. And I'm talking about films of the Feather River Canyon in Colorado and on to the West Coast and Grand Canyon and all of this. And these films were half an hour, 3/4 of an hour long. We also went to United Airlines. They made films, and we borrowed their films. And we would run those films on the air. And when we ran out of films, we signed off the station. And maybe it was 2.5 hours, 3 hours, or whatever. We got Bendix as a sponsor, and we began putting a newscast on at the close of the day. When we ran out of films, we would do a live newscast at the end of the day, 15 minutes around in there.
What time of the day?
Time of the evening?
Yes.
Could be 9 o'clock. Could be 9:15. Could be 8:30. What? Not necessarily ever a regular time as we have 10 o'clocks, 6 o'clocks, noons today.
And you were responsible for the news program.
And I put together the news program. And the other 2 people, Hugh Bader and Lou Jeffrey, would alternate in directing and working as the production man on the floor. Some people call him an associate director. Some people call him a stage manager, the fellow who gives you the cues of the minutes. And we would do that for each other. When Lou Jeffrey was working on the air, I'd work on the floor and I'd give him the minute cues. And when Bader was working on the air doing a sports program of some sort, and we did have a half-hour sports program that we put on every week, then I might be in the booth doing the directing, and Lou would be on the floor doing the hand signals. It worked out. And with the limited number of people, we made it work.
When did it start?
It was so embryonic. And you see, there was no rule book.
When did it start to evolve to a regular newscast at a regular time, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock?
I would guess and say that we got stabilized when there was a permanent interconnection between Chicago and Omaha. And I really don't know the date. I would suggest that it was sometime in the area in 1951. We were interconnected in 1952 when we had, in the spring of 1952, when we had that flood scare in Omaha. It was a very, very near disaster. We were interconnected then because I remember Ed Murrow came out and did some work out of Omaha and out of our station on an interconnection to Chicago. So we probably established a newscast regularly at night at 10 o'clock or 9 o'clock when the interconnection came through.
What happened to the news department in this period of time in terms of growth?
I had a man, there was a darkroom man who was a film processor. He shot 4x5 speed graphic pictures or 35 millimeter pictures. He made slides for the station break slides, etc., and could shoot pictures of news, except he was principally a processor, a darkroom man rather than a shooter. I did the shooting myself. I had him teach me how to shoot the speed graphic camera. And I did the shooting on news stories that I could cover. And I had time in the daytime to cover because we weren't on the air. I could work from 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning. City council meetings in Chicago, whatever news happened to come up that I heard about or knew about or could find out about. County board meetings, police stories, etc., fires. And I would shoot them on speed graphic. I would bring the holders back in. The darkroom man would process them and make 8x10 prints, matte prints, not glossy, but matte. When we got the story written and we incorporated the pictures in the story, I'd make a carbon, of course, of the script. And I would indicate on the script where I wanted the pictures to be. And I would take the pictures and staple them onto a cardboard, about so. Staple them in the center on guidelines that we had drawn. Those pictures then we would put on an easel and put them in front of the second camera in the studio, if we had a second camera. If we didn't have a second camera, we had a complication, but we managed to get to them, get to the pictures. Re-rack the lens. In those days, no zoom lenses. Black and white cameras, small black and white cameras. And we would then put the pictures on the air. And the sequence was that on the cue from the director, the stage manager would pull the picture out. And the effect on the tube would be it's just a blur, and it'd go on to the second picture, and blur, go on to the third picture, fourth picture, how many ever there were in sequence. And I did that, and the darkroom man processed the pictures, and I had a screaming need for help. I needed a reporter or two to help me out, and I got permission from the management to hire a man, a full-time reporter. His name was Dick Trembath, and he and I worked together for, it could have been a couple of years. I'm really vague on the time on this. We worked together, shooting, getting things put on the air. Dick did not work on the air. He was not an airman in any sense of the word. He would not have wanted to. He did not want to. He loved to cover news, and he was a crackerjack reporter. Took him from the Nonpareil Council Bluffs newspaper. He was out of the University of Iowa, journalism student, graduate.
What then evolved as you got some additional personnel? And
we just grew. We added second and third reporters. We still did not have any film cameras. We not only didn't have the film cameras to shoot film, we did not have the processing capability. To think about shooting film and sending it to Chicago by airline and getting it back 2 days later was just not even slightly real, so we didn't get involved in that. We were, however, battling a situation where the second station in town, WOW, did have a processing machine. They had it from the time they started on the air and had their own film cameras. And this was leverage for us to go to our management and say, look, this is what we're competing with. This is what we've got right up the street here, and this is what's on Channel 6 in Omaha. We're on Channel 3, and all the people have to do is flip over to 6 and see those pictures move by themselves. And they were doing quite a good job. They had a good, large, competent staff working for them. So we use this, or I use this as leverage, talking to the boss about getting our own stuff. In case of dire emergency, I would go to the Samartic Detective Agency in Omaha, which is the armored car company at that time, and I would borrow a movie camera that they owned. They had a very high quality, very expensive movie camera. It's called a Cine Special, that they used to shoot film of errant wives or husbands in connection with divorce cases. And they were very generous with us. Bob Samartic was a friend, and his son, and they saved us at times. They let us use their camera to shoot film. And I'm mindful of the case of a flood in Kansas City. It was really a disastrous thing. It flooded the stockyards of Kansas City. A lot of the city was very, very destructive. This was in 1951, and when you are without, you have to become very resourceful in getting things. So I suggested to this man who ran our film lab, who did our darkroom work, that we should go down and get some film footage of the Kansas City flood for our news coverage. And he looked at me as though I were out of my mind, and he said, how do you intend to do this? And I said, well, first let's call Samartic and see if we can get their camera and see if they have any film, because we didn't even have any film. And they said, yes, we could use their camera, and they had several spools of 200-foot reels, and we used a 200-foot magazine, which was good. Then my friend said, now how do you propose that we get to Kansas City? If we drive, it will take forever and a day. I said, yes, that's true. So I called the Public Relations Department at the Strategic Air Command at Offutt Air Force Base, and I said to the PR man who was a friend, I said, don't you think that it would be helpful and useful for some people from the Strategic Air Command and from Offutt Air Force Base to take an airplane and fly down and take a look at the Kansas City flood? And he likened us how that would be an educational process for the Air Force. And I said, good, what time are we going to take off? And he said, we will leave at such and such a time. I said, fine. Dale Hoagland, who is our darkroom man, will be there with a movie camera, and I would like to have him go along. I said, what is the aircraft? And they said it was a B-25. And I said, that's fine. Maybe he can shoot from the nose of the B-25. So I went to Dale Hoagland and I said, it's all arranged for you to go to Kansas City with the Air Force. He said, I did all of the flying with the Air Force that I wanted to in World War II when I was a tail gunner. I said, yeah, but this is going to be different, Dale, so you don't have to worry about it. All you have to do is shoot with a movie camera. So he allowed us how he could do that, and he made the trip down to Kansas City with the Air Force. And he came back up with, I think, 300 feet of film. The problem with it was all aerial. The Air Force people didn't want to land. Fairfax Airport was pretty well underwater anyhow, so it would have been difficult. And Dale came back in with the film. He says, now what in the heck are you going to do with it? I said, well, while you've been away, I've talked to a friend of mine who has promised me that he will get us access to the film processing machine of our competition. And I said, you give me the film and I'll take care of it. And it was sort of like a surreptitious spy drop. I handed the film off to my friend, who put it through their machine and gave it back to me. in negative film. We put it in the machine. We looked at it in the viewer in our editing room, and we didn't have much time. We put it in the machine, in the transmitter, in a film chain, and reversed the polarity on the film chain. And in our newscast that evening, we put on the first and only films that Omaha saw of the Kansas City flood in 1951. This was quite a coup, and it did great things to warm our hearts and to boost our confidence and make us feel very, very good about what we had done. And that's a long story.
No, your title at this time is news director at KMPV and anchor?
Ex officio, or whatever you want to call it. I was self-appointed news director, and I was anchoring. I was the only one doing any news on the air, yes.
At the time that you left KMTV to go to Chicago to WMAQ-TV, the NBC-owned and operated station, was that essentially the situation you had progressed at that point to the more formalized news operation? What was your title then? What were your responsibilities in 1960?
I was still news director and news anchor at 6 and 10 o'clock.
But more in a more formal sense, apparently.
Yes, more accepted as the news director, yes.
And what were the newscasts like at KMTV prior to the time that you left for Chicago?
Color film with our own color processing machine, color cameras studio, first color cameras west of the Mississippi. I don't remember what the year would be, probably 55, 56, somewhere in that area. Our programs were early morning Today Show cut-ins. By this time we had switched over to NBC. Noon, 15 minutes at 6 o'clock in the evening, half an hour at 10 o'clock at night. And all of them I produced, wrote, and aired the 6 and the 10 o'clock shows. The earlier one was produced, written, and aired by another man who was the other newscaster in the building.
Who was that?
His name was, Bill Talbot. I'm getting confused with Chicago now. Bill Talbot had been a radio man at KOIL in Omaha, joined us, and was quite a good man. They were good shows. I think they were solid, complete shows. I think they were as well presented as you could find in that day. And we would look back at them now and say, my God, how primitive.
Let's talk about your own personal career changes now. When you went to Chicago in 1960, as I understand it, you went to WMAQ, which was the owned and operated station by the National Broadcasting Company at that point.
Yes.
What was your responsibility when you went to Chicago?
I first went to Chicago to be the Midwest correspondent for NBC News, replacing Sander Van Oker, who was on the campaign trail with Jack Kennedy, covering him, and was scheduled to go on to the White House with Kennedy if and when he won the election. But either way, he was, whether he went to the White House or not, he was not going to return to Chicago, and I was to be the Midwest correspondent. And also I was loaned out to the local station, Channel 5, to do the Today Show cut-ins at 7:25 and 8:25 in the morning. I was not going to do any 10 o'clock newscasting. I was done with that. I had 2 children by this time, and I wanted to help raise them. And I hadn't been at home in the evening hours except to come home and have dinner with them in all the time that they'd been alive. And I told my wife, I think that's a good part of this move to Chicago, that I'll be free for the evenings. And she said, yes, and I will give you 2 months. And it was 2 months and 11 days, and I started doing a 10 o'clock news show in Chicago.
Your wife had great insight, apparently.
She probably knew what was going on. She was smarter than I was. I didn't know what was going on when they hired me. I didn't realize that they wanted me to replace Alex Dreyer, who was doing the 10 o'clock show. But I found out quickly.
How long did you have that set of responsibilities?
I did that until 1976, in June of 1976, so it was essentially 16 years. And I worked, for 11 of those years, I did a five-minute news program on the NBC television network out of Chicago at various times in the day. I did it at 9:25, 11:55, and 1:25. It was sort of like what the television counterpart of the radio news on the hour. 5-minute newscasts in midday or early in the day to let people know what was going on in the world when there was no news on the air. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I did those along with working for the Huntley Brinkley Show and inserting stories out of Chicago, and also doing the 10 o'clock newscast on Channel 5, locally in Chicago.
So you really essentially had about 3 jobs there, if I counted them.
Yeah, I was working for both the network and the local station, which of course was owned by the network, but it was separate, totally separate and divided.
What was the atmosphere at that point in terms of television news, both in Chicago and at the network? You mentioned the Huntley Brinkley Report, which of course was quite prominent at that time. What was the atmosphere in terms of priorities for news, in terms of programming, priorities for the network, resources, this sort of thing?
There was always quite a bit of competition on the priority between the local station and the Huntley Brinkley Show or the network. If push ever came to shove, if it really came down to the nitty-gritty, the Huntley Brinkley Show would emerge victorious. But there was still, this did not preclude quite a lot of skirmishing going on the local territory. We tried to avoid that as often as possible and let the people in New York take the blame for it, or let them do the calling and telling the local people in Chicago this is the way it's going to be. But we also had a separate shooting section for network versus the local, so that we might go out and stand side by side with each other shooting the same story and come back into the same house and get the same processing, but the network film went over here for cutting and the local film went over here for cutting and went its separate ways to be transmitted and put on the air. See what I mean?
What were your individual responsibilities at this point? You were an anchor at the 10 o'clock news, you were the correspondent. What did you physically do in terms of handling the stories?
I would go back to the first thing I would do when a story came in from a photographer who worked out in the field, and a lot of our network photographers always worked alone. They did not necessarily work with a correspondent out telling them what to do. These were very sensible, very seasoned, very experienced guys. They had been doing it for a long time. A lot of them came out of the old Pathé News, the old Movietone News era, and they knew how to shoot news. They knew what news was all about. They knew what made picture value. So when the film came out of the processing and came into the house, I was there with the network editor who cut only for the network. We screened the film if there was time. If there wasn't time, we ran it through a viewer to see what was on the film. And sitting there at a desk in the viewing room with New York on my ear, telling them what was in the film, what we had. New York coming back and saying, have you got this? I say, no, we don't have this, but we've got that. This, that, sound, silent, etc. How much do you think it's worth? I say it's worth nothing. I would throw it out. I would say it's worth a minute 10. I'd say it's worth 2 minutes. They say, what's your best judgment? Let's do it at a minute and a half. And I'll call you back for the lead-in, give you information for the lead-in. Tell the editor we want a minute and a half or a minute 20, whatever we decided on. And if you have any questions about how we wanted it assembled, just give me a holler. He was a thoroughly seasoned, experienced man. He'd cut film for the network news for a long time. He knew how to do it. He didn't really need any help from me. I would go to my desk and I would start the story on supposition of how he would arrange the shots, the scenes, and we'd put the words down just tentatively on paper, go back and read it with the first cut of the film. Maybe we'd tighten up a scene here, maybe we'd tighten up a scene there, maybe we'd tighten up a sentence considerably here on the script, and we'd get the whole thing into sync. We'd get back on the phone with New York, give them a suggested lead-in to the story, tell them exactly what we had in the film so there was never any surprise or mistake, how long it ran exactly, and they would give us a feed time. This was before tape. There was tape. We had videotape in the house. We had 2-inch videotape. But this was before pre-taping. In other words, we didn't tape this in Chicago and just run the tape into New York or run it into the show. We, most of the time, did the story live out of Chicago to tape in New York. And if need be, we did it live out of Chicago, live into the show, which is hairy. And at times scary, because the timing has to be exact. There can be no miscues, no flubs, no broken sprockets on the film, no nothing. As Brinkley had a wise word about television at one time, he said, "Somehow it works."
Now
and it did, generally.
This was a time in which the NBC news program, Huntley Brinkley program, was the preeminent national news program.
Yes. And it was only 15 minutes long at that time, most of that time.
Occasionally, at that period of time, it was difficult, I suppose it still is, to get the New York producers to do a show that is not New York-based or not Washington-based, putting international stories aside. But it sounds as if you got many stories from Chicago on the network newscast at that time.
Yes.
How did that play? How did you feel that was being accepted in New York?
Well, it really started in Omaha, ironically. The Huntley Brinkley show went on the air in 1956. Am I talking too long?
No, go right ahead.
In 1956, Huntley Brinkley came on the air, and we had the Charlie Starkweather story here in Lincoln. We had other stories going on in the Midwest that were important, that were big stories, that were of national importance and interest. And I got to know on the telephone, but not to know in person, the editor of the Huntley Brinkley show and the executive producer. And they would call me, and they'd say, "Are you covering such and such a story?" And I'd say, "Yeah," knowing full well that we were not. "Are you interested in it?" "Yeah, we're interested in it." I said, "When my film gets back in and I take a look at it, I will give you a call and let you know what's in it." And they said, "That's fine." I would put down the phone and holler at Dick Trimbath or somebody, "Get going on this particular story because I think the network is interested in it." And maybe we had planned to shoot it. Chances are we had, but maybe we had not, but we did. And I think this is opportunism. This is taking advantage of a situation that can be good for everybody involved. And we wound up with a very generous and good relationship with Huntley and Brinkley, and with Reuben Frank, who was the executive producer, and Elliot Frankel, who was the news editor. It got to a point of where we were feeding the Huntley Brinkley show out of Omaha once a week, an average of 52 times a year. This was more at that time than Chicago was doing. And this was one of the reasons why Reuben Frank was happy when I went to Chicago, because he felt that we could continue this association in Chicago, which we did. We continued very aggressively to cover news in the Midwest and work hard on it, work fast on it, get it ready for the show, and make it a good presentation. I sound like I'm blowing my own horn here, I think. I think we did a good job. I think we covered it well, and I think it was good for them and us.
Now, as I gather, the world got more complex. The network got more complex. The issues in the local station in Chicago got more complex. There was more money involved in terms of doing this. And so, essentially, it is more than it sounds as if you're working 20 hours a day to be able to do the 10 o'clock news at night and the NBC news as well. How did you put all that together? How did you do all that?
Well, it wasn't as much as it sounds, really. And remember that this was not every day. This may have been, it may have been every day for a week, and maybe we went a week with only one day. You know the whims of news, and you know that it's on again, off again. But in those days, we were working with some very, very hot items, some very big items. We were in the midst of the civil rights revolt. We had demonstrations and this, that, and the other thing going on all the time having to do with civil rights. And we were not high on crime in those days, but we were high on the civil rights and all of the ramifications of that. And a lot of our film people were traveling a lot into distances, areas away from Chicago that we still had to handle their stories, even though we hadn't gone out and eyeballed the story ourselves. We managed to put it all together. We managed to handle it all. I did not do the writing of the 10 o'clock show in Chicago. I took for myself the province of editing what was written for me. And I have always done this. When someone writes a story for me to go on the air, there are several criteria about that story. Number one, I must see that story and read it through before I put it on the air. I will not put something on the air that I have not read and seen. And number two, I take the jurisdiction of editing that story, of either doing minor rewrites and minor changes in it, or a major overhaul of the story if I think that is what it needs. Simply because I'm the one involved in it. If you want to write this, if you want to take the story the way it stands and put it on the air yourself, that's your business. But with me, I want it the way I want it. I want it the way I think it's right.
Because when they see you, you get the praise or blame.
I'm the praise or the blame. Exactly.
You had the opportunity also to do the news on the National Broadcasting Company's Today Show for a number of years.
Yes.
How did that fit into your overall professional life?
Well, that was horrendous because it was getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning. I lived in Connecticut, 45 minutes away from the office. They sent a limousine out to pick me up every morning, and I left at, I would leave the house at 3:30. I'd get into the studio at about 4:15. I'd go through all of the wire copy from the night before, and that was Reuters, AP, UP. I would, on the way in the car, in the 45-minute trip, I would read the New York Times and the Daily News. So I felt that by the time I got ready to write at 6:15, 6 o'clock maybe, I was fairly well informed. There was a producer there to supervise. We did 4 news shows in the 2 hours. 8, 8:30, or 7, 7:30, 8, and 8:30. There were the executive producer, or the producer of the program, and 2 other writers. They handled the other three shows. I did the first show at 7 o'clock. I couldn't do the other 3 others because I couldn't get out of the studio long enough. I'd finish up one show at about 6 minutes after 7, and I had another show coming up at about 23 minutes after 7. So I only had about 10 or 12 minutes in between shows. And so I would get the second show immediately after the first one, and I would work it over with the pen in the studio and put it on the air, and that's the way it went for the full 2 hours of the Today Show. I was done work for the day at 9 o'clock in the morning. And the car was out in front in the plaza at Rockefeller Center whenever I wanted to go home. I would tell them what time I would be going home. And sometimes I got home at 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock, around in there. very difficult schedule, very difficult, because I had to go to bed at 8 o'clock at night to get a decent night's sleep, and that's difficult to do when the sun isn't even down in the summertime. It was too much of a disruption of my life. I did it for 3.5 years. I told them after 2.5 years, I said, this is a 3-year contract term. I will not renew at the end of 3 years. I want you to know 6 months in advance so that everything will be smooth. And they said, fine, it's all right. But they still took a full year to come up and decide on a replacement, which sort of irritated me, but I had to leave it because, it's not that I didn't like newscasting, and I didn't mind the work. It was work that I was trained to do or trained myself to do, and I was experienced in it, and it was not difficult. It was just the hourly schedule that killed me.
But again, this was a time when the Today Show also was extraordinarily successful, so it was probably a good time to be part of the team on the Today Show. And the news
ironically, though, as we were talking earlier today, the Today Show was in turmoil in those days. Barbara Walters had announced that she was going to go to ABC, and she was a fixture on the show. Frank McGee had died, and he had done the show. And Jim Hartz, who was a friend of McGee's and a good man, was filling in, but was not the permanent anchor. Tom Brokaw was announced as the new man. Tom came on board, but Barbara wasn't there. A lady from Betty Furness, who was an old movie actress and a consumer reporter in New York local, was filling in for Barbara, and she was not going to stay. They were still casting around looking for someone to take her job, and they ultimately settled on Jane Pauley out of Chicago.
Who had worked with you in Chicago.
Who had anchored with me in Chicago, most unsuccessfully for about a year. We had a program that just did not work, and it wasn't that there was bad chemistry. We liked each other very much. We were good friends then. We still are now, but it didn't work. Maybe I don't co-anchor well. I don't know, but she came on board the Today Show, and everything really settled down. But by that time, there was a great loss of audience. And GMA on ABC, Good Morning America on ABC, with David Hartman, if you remember, had made great inroads, and they were doing very, very well against NBC. I'm not sure in the 3.5 years that I was on the show we ever won it. We may have won the time period in the ratings, but I don't remember. But it was a good experience, except it was so damned uncomfortable.
But it made you, I suppose, an individual beyond the NBC regional correspondent in Chicago. It made you a very visible broadcast journalist to the nation during the time that you were on the Today Show, because you were there at that point. Now, when you decided to move on from the Today Show, you eventually found yourself back in Chicago.
Well, I went into documentary making with NBC. We did several things. I traveled with the Pope on his trip to the United States in 1979. I went to England and traveled with him when he went up to when he went in to see the Bishop of Canterbury, and went up to Edinburgh for the meeting with the Presbyterians. I made a couple of shows in Rome on the Council of Bishops, and enjoyed it very much. But there really wasn't much to do. It was sort of a 2 or 3 shows a year job. I was 55, and I felt that it was time to stand down and relax a bit. I took early retirement out of NBC and went into the woods of New Canaan, Connecticut, and spent 3 years in retirement until a friend of mine called me and asked me to come to work in Chicago at ABC. And made it quite attractive for me to come back into newscasting and do very, very little work each day. A minimal of work. And I anchor one program for a half hour from 6 to 6:30 in the evening. And we've had a remarkable success with it for 10 years now. And I have another year to go on a contract.
This is WLS-TV in
At
Chicago.
Channel 7 in Chicago, WLS.
Which is owned by the ABC Cap Cities
ABC,
Corporation.
yes.
Now, who is this friend, and why did he suddenly call you from the woods of Connecticut?
Well, he and I had worked together at Channel 5. He was a sports producer there. He worked for Johnny Morris, who was a sportscaster in Chicago. His name is Dennis Swanson. He went from Channel 5 in Chicago to Los Angeles, where he worked for ABC and News, became the news director of that television station out there, went into Chicago at the request of ABC to clean up a mess in Channel 7. By that I mean Channel 7 was in very bad shape, losing everything, losing all of the ratings everywhere. And he went into Chicago in mid-1983 to clean up the mess. This is not uncommon in our business. And when he got there, he decided to make certain moves and certain changes. The first thing that he did was to bring into Chicago and audition a woman from Baltimore whose name was Oprah Winfrey. And after interviewing her, he put her under contract to do a local talk show, not a talk show, a local Good Morning type of show on Channel 7 in Chicago. Then he talked to a couple of other people about coming to work at Channel 7, and he called my agent in New York and asked to speak to me. My agent said, "Do you want to talk to him?" I said, "Sure, I'll talk to him. He's an old friend." And Dennis called me and he said, "I want you to come back to Chicago." And I said, "I don't want to come back to Chicago. I don't have any desire to do that." He said, "I want you to come back here and newscast with me on Channel 7 on ABC station here." I said, "I spent a good share of my life in Chicago fighting Channel 7. Now you're asking me to come back and go to work for them." He said, "Yes, I want you to do that." I said, "No, Dennis, it's a kind offer and I appreciate that, but I don't really, I'm well retired and I don't need the money and I don't really want to do that." He said, "Come back to Chicago and talk to me." I said, "All right, as a courtesy, I will do that." And I did. I made a trip to Chicago and stayed a couple of days and talked a lot of hours, and we did a lot of talking and drinking and eating, and he made me an extremely generous offer and asked me to come back and do one program a day at 6 o'clock in the evening for him. I knew that my wife did not want to come back to Chicago. I knew my wife didn't want to leave the woods of Connecticut because it was beautiful up there. And I said to her, "Do you want to go to Chicago?" And she said, "I do not want to go to Chicago." I said, "You should think about the fact that your daughter is in Chicago, and that your daughter is married and she has her first son, your grandchild. You should think about the fact that your son is in Denver and that he is married and has two grandchildren. Your mother is in Omaha and your sisters are west of Omaha and your brother is in the state of Washington." I said, "You have no one that you love and you care for between here and Chicago. And you are out of place. Geographically, you are out of place. And you should be at least in Chicago, if not further west." And I said, "Besides, Dennis has made a very generous offer, and I think it can work out." The upshot of it was that my wife is very protective of me because she loves me. And we go back to high school together. And we've been married for 48 years now. And she was afraid that I would be hurt. And I said to her, don't worry about me. I'm a grown person. I'm an adult. I can take care of myself, and I'm not going to get hurt. So we came back to Chicago, and we started to work in 1984, and it's been a magnificent success.
Earlier, you described yourself as somebody who just plain likes news. And in our few remaining moments, one of the things that is interesting is to find somebody who's had the opportunity to work in a job that they like. Talk about working in television news and how that sort of thing has been a part of your life.
Well, it's been so good for me. I don't know of anyone who is more fortunate than I am. There have been times that I worked in television news that I have enjoyed myself more than I do today. When you think about the film of that Kansas City flood, and it was at least 10 years after that happened that I informed the people at that other station what had happened to them, and they didn't know about it. Those are fun days. And we had a lot of good times in Omaha, and we had a lot of good times in Chicago. There is not as much fun today. I think a lot of the changes that have occurred are not so very good, that do not serve us well, and we may take a rap for them someday for what's happening and what has happened. But all in all, as I said, it has been truly an outstanding existence for me. I couldn't have written it better when you consider what little I had to offer it at the very beginning and what I've gained from it.
Thank you. We've been talking with Floyd Kalber, who has enjoyed a career ranging from Omaha to Kearney, Nebraska, to Peoria, to Omaha, to Chicago, to New York, who has had the experience of working with some of the most famous people in the world in broadcast journalism and covered many other famous people. Thank you very much for participating in our discussion today. I'm Larry Walklin.